After more than 2 years on the defensive, Ukrainian forces have flipped the script, pouring over the Russian border and seizing control of more than 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory in just less than a week. And unlike in Ukraine's previous and usually short-lived raids across the border, this time their forces are settling in for a fight, fortifying defensive positions throughout the occupied Kursk region in what Ukrainian officials are calling a buffer zone to protect against continued airstrikes launched into Ukraine from the area. Behind the rifles of thousands of battle-hardened troops, Ukraine has taken hundreds of Russian soldiers prisoner and captured dozens of towns and villages. But the biggest blow of this ongoing offensive may be to the reputation and standing of Russian President Vladimir Putin. So let's talk about the Ukrainian invasion of Russia, how it's played out so far, and what it aims to accomplish. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Firepower. With Ukraine's invasion of Russia still underway, the information war that runs parallel to this conflict in digital spaces is still very much alive and well, and few stories better represent that than this one, about a dual US-Russian national who was just convicted in a Russian court for high treason and sentenced to 12 years in a penal colony. Her crime? Donating $51 to a US-based Ukrainian charity. That's it. That's the whole crime, but you'd be hard-pressed to know that depending on the political or geopolitical affiliations of the news outlets that you frequent. And that's why ground news can be such a handy tool for staying on top of what's going on in the world and poking a hole through the bias that's so commonly found in today's media coverage. Ground News is an aggregator that collects news stories from outlets published all around the world and consolidates them all into a single, easy-to-read feed. For every story you find on Ground News, you can not only find a high-level summary, but you can sift through the headlines from different news outlets covering the same story, along with vital information about that outlet's political affiliations, its ownership, and its factuality rating. Russian state media and right-leaning outlets emphasize things like the word treason or the length of the sentence. Whereas on the other side, the reason for those treason charges, that $51 donation, is highlighted way more frequently. And being able to quickly make that comparison is one of the big reasons why I use Ground News every day, but it's not the only one. I also love features like their blind spot page, which shows you stories that are getting a great deal of coverage in one political sphere and not in the other. It not only helps me to make sure that I don't have these blind spots, but it also helps me to better understand how the world can look so different depending on a person's political affiliation. And in today's media climate, that's more important than ever. And that's why I'm a big fan of Ground News. And I think you will be too. In fact, I can even get you a great deal. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off the very same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan to help you stay on top of things. Now, I actually have a pretty interesting update into Lockheed Martin's SR-72 program that was going to run today, but clearly I needed to pivot because of the news cycle, so expect that video to drop sometime next week. And in the meantime, just bear with me a bit on the footage. There's not a lot that I can use from the Ukraine-Russia conflict without YouTube demonetizing my videos. Now, in the morning of August 6th, Ukrainian forces launched a surprise offensive into western Russia, one that had somehow been planned and staged behind a veil of complete secrecy. The attack was such a surprise, in fact, that it not only took Russia's border troops completely off guard, but Ukraine's western allies as well, at least if statements made by various government officials are to be believed. But we now know that at least some Russian officials were notified of signs of this impending attack and opted to ignore them, and that leads me to believe that at least some Western intelligence agencies likely saw those signs as well. Ukrainian troops in armored vehicles moved quickly, crossing the border on multiple vectors and capturing town after town in rapid succession. As news of the secret offensive reached the media, it was accompanied by social media posts uploaded by Ukrainian troops, showing them pulling Russian flags down, tossing them aside into the track-laden mud as they went. In one video vetted by the New York Times, a Ukrainian soldier can be seen standing on the shoulders of another, breaking the Russian flag off of its wooden post and tossing it aside. That video has been confirmed to have been taken in the Russian village of Sverdlovskovo, just a few miles inside the border. Another video, filmed about 5 miles further west, shows a similar scene, with one Ukrainian soldier tossing a Russian flag in the mud as another poses, flexing his muscles. And while Russia usually keeps a pretty tight lid on this sort of thing, this was the sort of incursion they couldn't simply gloss over with propaganda. I'm going to quote Ruslan Pukov, the director of Moscow's CAST security research group, from an interview he did with the New York Times just a few days ago. The first days of the Ukrainian operation in the Kursk region should be assessed as very successful, although its ultimate goals remain unclear. In moral terms, the Russian Federation has taken a powerful blow. And while this effort has arguably only been as successful as it has, thanks to an immense degree of secrecy surrounding it, in hindsight, it's beginning to get easier to see how it all came together. A drone battalion from Ukraine's 22nd Mechanized Brigade was spotted near the Russian border in July after more than a year of fighting on the front lines some 80 miles to the west. Troops from the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, last known to be fighting elsewhere in the Kharkiv region, were spotted near the border soon after, and before long, more troops from the 80th Air Assault Brigade seemed to join them. This massing of forces, despite its secrecy, did not go unnoticed by Russian intelligence and by Russian civilians near the border. According to Andrei Gurulyov, a prominent member of Russia's parliament and a former senior-ranking officer in the Russian army, a report on the buildup was even submitted to Russian leadership nearly a month before this assault began. I'm going to quote Gurulyov from an appearance he made on Russian state television this week. But from the top came the order not to panic, and that those above know better. But while this offensive has clearly progressed in Ukraine's favor thus far, it certainly hasn't come without a cost. But for Ukrainian troops who've been fighting uphill for more than 2 years, they're pretty accustomed to paying that fee. I'm going to quote a 43-year-old Ukrainian soldier asked to be named only Ivan, who was interviewed by reporters after returning from the front lines of this offensive after being injured. As he said, "Grenades and mortars look the same wherever you are." Ivan's experiences over the past few weeks serve as a grim reminder that even this successful operation hasn't been easy. He and his unit were advancing into Russian territory at an average of an astonishing 10 kilometers, or around 6.2 miles per day, fighting their way across open fields and railway lines and rotating in fresh troops under cover of darkness as each night fell. But after 3 days of fighting off their back feet, Russian forces finally started to get their act together, unleashing an onslaught of airdropped glide bombs into the Ukrainian forces on the third night, despite the obvious collateral damage it was doing to the Russian territory they were occupying. These glide bombs have proven highly effective for Russian forces in recent months. They're similar in function to America's own JDAM-ERs, made up of satellite guidance kits and expandable glide wings mounted onto inexpensive gravity or dumb bombs. They're very tough to intercept, they offer a high degree of precision, and they can be dropped from aircraft as far as 40 miles out. As Ivan recalls, his unit instantly lost a dozen men when the first wave of glide bombs hit, with several others, including him, being injured. I'll quote him again. "Everything was burning. Arms here, legs there." Ivan himself took shrapnel to the groin and chest, forcing him to be evacuated back to Ukraine for medical treatment and allowing him to share a few scant details about the ongoing operation with journalists from The Economists. But after nearly 30 months of fighting for its survival, Ukraine is no stranger to loss. Even as Russian glide bombs rained down, the offensive progressed, and the following day, on Saturday the 10th, some Ukrainian units reported pressing a full 40 kilometers, about 25 miles into Russia, rapidly closing on the city of Kursk, which serves as the oblast's capital. And Ivan isn't the only wounded Ukrainian soldier from the ongoing offensive who can shine some light on how Ukraine has managed to capture more territory in a week than Russia has in months. A 28-year-old paratrooper from Ukraine's 33rd Brigade named Anagol made it 30 kilometers, or a bit more than 18 miles into Russia before he was wounded. He isn't sure if he was hit by artillery fire, a Russian glide bomb, or maybe even friendly fire, such as the haze of battle out on the front lines. But what Anagol does know, however, is that even amid the heavy fighting, Russian troops were on the run. Enabled by airstrikes and artillery fire from above, the Russians fled their defensive positions, abandoning equipment, weapons, and ammunition as they ran. It would seem the defensive positions inside the Russian border believed the looming threat of escalation, a red line drawn by Putin that seen Western governments disallow the use of their weapon systems inside Russian territory, would be enough to insulate them from the fighting. As thousands of battle-hardened Ukrainian troops tore through the region, they seemed to continue to take Russians by surprise, even days into the offensive. This time, I'm going to quote an unnamed member of Ukraine's general staff who spoke to journalists from The Economists. "We sent our most combat-ready units to the weakest point on their border. Conscript soldiers faced paratroopers and simply surrendered. And surrender they did." By the 13th, just 7 days into Ukraine's surprise invasion, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that 74 Russian towns and villages were now under Ukrainian occupation, and that hundreds of Russian troops had surrendered along the way. According to media reports, Ukrainian forces not only captured 102 Russian soldiers out of the 488th Guards Motorized Rifle Regiment in a single engagement, but they even captured their fortified position as well. I'm going to quote an unnamed source who spoke to Reuters under the condition of anonymity. "They captured and cleared a sprawling, concrete, and well-fortified company stronghold from all sides, with underground communications and personnel accommodation, a canteen, an armory, and even a bathhouse." And I know all this emphasis on Western media coverage and unnamed sources is sure to irk some people out there in the audience, but you should know that the story is not better coming out of Russian state media. According to their reporting, more than 132,000 Russian civilians have already been forced to flee their homes in the Kursk region to avoid the Ukrainian offensive. By the day after Zelensky's speech, the number of Russian towns and villages inside Ukrainian control had expanded once again to 82. Further emphasizing one of Zelensky's primary points in his speech, that Russia brought war to others, and now it was coming home. Now, it is worth noting that despite the hesitation of Western leaders to allow Ukraine to take their fight onto Russian soil, it's evident that this offensive has involved the widespread use of American-supplied vehicles, arms, and munitions, in what some argue could be seen as a violation of one of Putin's most stringent red lines. However, US officials don't see it that way. With countless long-range strikes launched into Ukrainian territory from the Kursk region, both Ukrainian and American officials have deftly taken to calling the offensive a self-defense action. Or as the Pentagon's Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh put it, they are taking actions to protect themselves from attacks. And while Ukraine's progress into Russia has slowed in recent days, those protective actions have not. On Wednesday night, Ukraine launched its largest long-range drone attack into Russian territory to date, engaging weapons storage facilities and warehouses across 4 different Russian Air Force installations. Some sources suggest these attacks were aimed at reducing Russia's available inventory of glide bombs. Now, Russia claims to have shot down 117 drones and at least 4 missiles during this attack, and satellite images do seem to dispute or refute at least some of these claims, but at the time of recording this, the real outcomes of these strikes remains somewhat murky. One thing is certain, however, and that's that Ukraine's advance into Russian territory has slowed in recent days, almost certainly because of a combination of a renewed Russian defensive and concerns about Ukraine's supply lines. As one unnamed source within Ukraine's general staff put it, they're not certain they could maintain logistics any further than 80 to 100 kilometers outside their own borders, and they clearly don't intend to push their luck in that regard. Instead, battening down the hatches and fortifying their positions inside newly occupied Russian territory. And with that seemingly clear indication that Ukraine has no intention to give up this land anytime soon, we have to ask ourselves once again, what is the overarching strategy that this offensive plays into? Now, to some extent, the overall motives behind this offensive remain somewhat murky, but that's almost certainly because there are actually multiple overlapping objectives. As the Atlantic Council contends, the Ukrainian attack's most obvious goal is to force Russia to realign after months of grueling but steady progress, pushing deeper and deeper into Ukrainian territory. I'm going to quote the Atlantic Council's Peter Dickinson. By attacking across the lightly defended border and seizing Russian territory, Ukrainian commanders believe they can force the Kremlin to withdraw troops from the front lines of the war in Ukraine in order to redeploy them for the defense of Russia itself. And that motive has seemingly been confirmed by several current and former Ukrainian officials, and to some extent, it appears to be working. The Ukrainian army has already reported Russia relocating some units out of both the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions of Ukraine's south. And according to the US-based think tank Institute for the Study of War, or the ISW, who's been tracking and reporting on claims made by pro-Russian military bloggers, at least some Russian irregular warfare units have been pulled out of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine to be redeployed in a defensive posture inside Russia. I'll quote the ISW's assessment here. Russian military command has determined that possible disruptions to the offensive operations in northern Kharkiv Oblast and other less critical frontline areas are an acceptable risk to adequately respond to the Ukrainian incursion in the Kursk Oblast. But to be clear, despite these changes, thus far, there's been little shift in Russia's overall defensive posture, even as Ukraine appointed Major General Eduard Moskalyov as the new commandant of their newly captured Russian territory. Ultimately, whether or not this offensive can force a redistribution of Russian forces across the front lines of the conflict, there are several other factors at play, some of which are easier to quantify than others. The psychological impact of Ukraine's rapid advance into Russia on both the Ukrainian and Russian populations cannot be overstated. For Ukraine, this rapid progress into Russia serves as a desperately needed boost for morale after years of Russia gobbling up territory off the backs of wave after wave of poorly trained conscripts, followed by more seasoned Russian troops. On the other side of the border, however, this attack has brought this war home for the Russian people, and perhaps even more importantly, shined a spotlight on Putin's inability to defend Russian soil or sovereignty amid a conflict his government still refuses to call a war. Even now, Putin's regime is referring to the new defensive effort inside Russia as a counter-terrorism operation, and Putin himself described the attack as nothing more than a large-scale provocation, both seemingly intentional ways of framing the offensive as less severe than a foreign military capturing Russian land. And to some extent, the value of this operation may ultimately be dictated by how Russia chooses to respond. If Ukraine succeeds in fortifying captured positions and really digging in, Russian forces will have no choice but to react, reducing the depth of seasoned warfighters on other fronts all throughout Ukraine. But if Russia doesn't mass enough forces to push Ukraine back, the seized territory could quickly become a bargaining chip in future negotiations for peace. And from a more macro-strategic perspective, Ukraine's attack and Russia's apparent inability to repel it has only further reduced Russia's military standing among global and even regional powers. Once seen as the world's second most potent military force, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated pretty conclusively that Russia's Cold War-era warfare doctrine struggles to function on the modern battlefield, that Russia's centralized command structure makes adaptation in the midst of a fight a painfully slow process, and Russia's emphasis on fielding small batches of high-profile platforms aimed at securing global prestige or lucrative foreign sales has come at the cost of significant atrophy across the breadth of Russia's conventional forces. As I've explained in the past about this conflict from an overarching strategic perspective regarding global competition between military powers, it doesn't matter who wins the war for Ukraine at this point. Now, I recognize that that sounds cynical and even downright insensitive to say, as Ukraine is continuing to fight for its very survival. But if you zoom out beyond the confines of this conflict, it's impossible to deny that this war has been a massive strategic loss for Russia and certainly for Vladimir Putin. Once seen as a strategic mastermind and arguably the only man who could return Russia to a romanticized vision of its former Soviet glory, there now seems to be little hope of Putin emerging from this war as anything other than the man who sacrificed a sizable portion of Russia's military power, hundreds of thousands of lives, international prestige, and a whole lot more, all to capture about 20% of a nation the size of Texas that shares a border with his country. Make no mistake, Ukraine's rapid success in taking Russian territory doesn't change Russia's massive numerical advantage in terms of both troops and military equipment. It doesn't change or undo the slow and steady gains Russia has made in recent months across the front lines. It doesn't take back Crimea or its wealth of natural resources, doesn't end the long-range missile strikes against both military and civilian targets all across Ukraine. It doesn't even mean Western governments are giving Ukraine free rein to use their supplied weapon systems as they please. But it does mark a significant shift in the momentum of this war. Like a turnover inside the red zone of a football game when you're behind. The immediate effect is an opportunity to score, to close the gap between the two sides. But the accompanying shift in momentum and in morale can change a whole lot more than that. And now, with Western-sourced F-16s starting to take to the sky, something many consider to be a momentum-shifting victory in itself, the timing couldn't be better for Ukraine to once again shock the world, and the Russian military with what it's capable of. Since the onset of this conflict, Russia has been watching the clock wind down on Western support for Ukraine, knowing full well that it was only a matter of time before partisan bickering and concerns about dollars spent would sour public perceptions of the effort. All they needed to do was outlast the Western public's attention span and financial tolerance, and once the flow of weapons and munitions dried up, Ukraine was as good as theirs. But now, with more than 100,000 Russians displaced from their homes and drone and missile strikes raining down deeper into Russian territory in greater numbers than ever before, the waiting game may have just turned on its head. Now, the question becomes, which population will fold first? Those providing support, or those being forced to flee their homes? And while the idea of Russian civilians on the run is not something anyone should celebrate, it does remind me of an old story I used to tell my Marines when we found ourselves in a bad situation of our own creation. A group of construction workers would meet in a parking lot of their job site every afternoon to break for lunch. And every day, one of the guys would open his lunchbox and sigh with disgust. An egg salad sandwich again, he'd lament, shaking his head and slamming the lunchbox shut. Finally, one day one of his coworkers just asked him, if you hate egg salad sandwiches so much, why not just ask your old lady to make you something different? And the first guy paused for a minute and then responded, what are you talking about? I make my own sandwiches. And with that ends yet another edition of Firepower from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the Force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.